Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I am just admitting the last few folks, and then I'll introduce and we'll get started. So I feel very lucky to be joined tonight by Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin. So Amy, you may also know if you've ever had a question through the Birds in Backyards inbox. She's been an incredible volunteer despite being a research academic in her own right, which I have no idea where she finds the time. So tonight she'll be talking to us about the birds and the bees. So the really complicated relationship that I think we'll learn about feral honeybees and native pollinators. Before we get stuck into that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm coming to you from, so the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country down in Melbourne. And we can take a moment to maybe reflect on the custodians of the lands from wherever we're calling them from. What we can do throughout the night is, if you've got any questions as they pop up, put them in the chat. And once Amy finishes her talk, we'll just go through those questions kind of conversation style. So yeah, feel free. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can put them in the chat as well, and I'll do my best to help, but I can't make any promises. But now I think I'll hand it over to you, Amy.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. And thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I know it's quite late at night, and yeah, I really appreciate you guys giving me the time of day. So yeah, like Annie said, we'll be talking about the birds and the bees, and really that's all what my research is about. I'm a lecturer at Western Sydney University, and really I'm interested in understanding how plants and pollinators interact. So a lot of my research has been on bees, and more recently it's been on birds as well, and how they interact with our Australian systems. And when we're talking about Australian systems, obviously a lot of my work is actually in native areas, so in national parks, especially around where I am in the Illawarra, but also it's in agriculture. So really what drives me is conservation. Okay, so I want to be understanding how we can conserve and protect our pollinators in natural systems, but also in those agricultural areas. Inevitably, as an ecologist though, we're always going to be studying the effects of disturbance. And more recently, my research has really focused in on understanding fire, especially after the big mega fire events that we had in 2019, 2020, but also climate change. So we have a Uke-based facility which looks at carbon dioxide and how carbon dioxide interacts with the floral resources that are available for pollinators out at Western Sydney. And also a lot of my research is about introduced species, which we'll be talking a bit about today, and including the European honeybee. So perceptions of pollinators in Australia. Increasingly and kind of worryingly, every time I talk about pollinators, everybody kind of looks at this fella here, the European honeybee, and says, "Oh, well, you know, they're declining in Australia." Australia has a very complex relationship with honeybees because obviously they're introduced, and they are in huge numbers of feral colonies across Australia. Obviously, I'm talking to bird people. So obviously you guys probably know that we have a great array of nectivorous pollinating birds here in Australia as well. Okay, so we're pretty fortunate in that way. But there's many animals that actually pollinate. Okay, bats are a fantastic pollinator. There's even some lizards that pollinate. Obviously a huge array of birds and other invertebrates. So not just the European honeybee, but we also have a large array of native bees, about 2,000 of them here in Australia, and other pollinating beetles and other insects. So when it comes to pollinators, I guess there's like a underlying perceived knowledge of what a pollinator actually is. You know, it's just something that visits a flower. But in reality, it's a little bit more tricky than that and a little bit more nuanced. So I thought I'd just walk you guys through what exactly is a pollinator first. And this applies to any vertebrate or invertebrate. But really the first step is it has to be able to transfer the pollen from the flower onto the organism itself. Okay, so that pollen needs to adhere somewhere on the body of the pollinator. they need to be able to transport that pollen then. Okay, so they can't just get rid of it or just eat it. They have to actually have it on them and then transport it. Once they've transported the pollen, they actually need to transfer it onto the stigma, so that female part of the flower. Okay. And once it's actually transferred onto the stigma, it then needs to actually affect fertilization of the ovules. Okay, so it's not just enough that we have something visiting a flower. We actually need the pollen to adhere. We need to be able to transport it. We need it to go onto that female part of the flower, and then fertilization actually to occur. So that would result in the seeds or in the fruit being produced. So here's just a little schematic of a honeybee in this case, and how cross-pollination occurs. Okay, so what we have here is the honeybee visiting flower. It's collecting pollen grains. Those pollen grains will adhere to the body somewhere, sometimes in the cubiculum, so those saddlebags that are on the back hind legs. And then it will travel and it will visit another flower and it will deposit it on the stigma, the female part of the flower. Okay, and this is what we call cross-pollination. Now, not all plants need a biological vector or a biological organism to enact pollination. We have wind pollinated plants, but specifically what we'll chat about today is something along these lines. Okay, so something that will need cross-pollination. So the importance of pollinators and pollination. Why do we need it? Well, obviously plants don't move. Okay, so in order for them to spread their gametes, so the pollen around, and for plants that need that cross-pollination, they need some sort of biological vector. And that's what pollinators do. Okay, so they're going to be the things that are moving between the plants and spreading those gametes around. Okay, and that's really important because most plants do reproduce sexually, and that's what we're talking about here. So pollinators really are that entrusted third party who deliver the pollen to the other plants and then the mates. Okay, but really, you know, why do pollinators do this service? Okay, well, it's a pretty easy one, and I'm sure you guys have probably read this book, which I'm a big fan of, but it's for food. Okay, so pollen is actually a major protein source for pollinators, for birds and for invertebrates as well. Okay, so it's a huge protein source. It's full of amino acids, which they need. Okay, the nectar, which if you've read this book, you'll know that Australia has a huge surplus of really fantastic species that produce copious amounts of nectar, such as eucalypts and banksias and grevilleas. And that nectar is really a rich source of sugars and energy. Okay. Pollen is often a limiting source in these environments. So often there's not enough pollen within an environment to enact the amount of seed set that plants are capable of actually creating. Okay, and the pollen itself is actually the male part of the plant. So it's the male gametes. Right. So I just really want to take a moment here just to really reiterate the fact that it's really more than just bees that we're talking about when we're talking about pollinators, especially here in Australia. Yes, there's known bees, which, you know, they make up about 10% of the pollinators, so about 20,000 worldwide species of bee, with about 2,000 here in Australia. But there's a whole range of other things that are pollinators. Okay, so birds, bats, beetles, flies. Every time you eat a mango, you can really thank a fly for that. Okay, so, you know, it's really important that we actually understand the role of pollinators and who are actually our pollinators within our systems. And although 90% of insect species remain undescribed by taxonomists, so you can see that there's actually going to be a whole lot more of potential pollinators out there in the insect world as well. Okay, so it's not just about how many species we have, though, in terms of how important they are as pollinators. What's really important is how they actually move within the flowers or between flowers. Okay, it's the abundance in which they're found and the frequency of the visits that they're doing. So how frequently are they visiting the flowers? How frequently are they moving between flowers or between plants? Another key characteristic is really the size of the organism as well. So obviously, when it comes to bees, they're really small, and they might be able to fit into a different shaped or smaller sized flower. But when it comes to our birds, obviously they're a lot larger. So there's a lot more surface area for that pollen to adhere to, and more chance of it really coming into contact with that stigma, that female reproductive part of the plant. Okay, so it's really not just about how many species, it's really about how they're moving, their behavior, their size, and what they're doing when they're visiting the plants themselves. So a key characteristic to know whether a particular organism is going to be an effective pollinator is really about the morphology of them. So here we have a picture of a bee. This is a solitary bee in New Zealand. And you can actually see just how hairy this organism is. Those little white and yellow speckles that are in the hair of this little bee, that's actually the pollen. Okay, so one of the key characteristics that our team really look at to work out whether something will be an effective pollinator is to look at the hairiness of the organism. Okay. Obviously, when it comes to birds, though, hairiness is not the thing we'll be looking at, but we'll be looking at the surface area that's covered with the pollen. So where it is on the organism. And then, obviously here we've got a rainbow lorikeet, it's covered in pollen. And when it goes to the next food source, it's obviously going to be coming into contact with that base as well and that beak area. Okay, so that's where the pollen is. That's what will be transferred onto that stigma as well. Okay. So a few things about behaviour and how they differ between birds and bees. So first of all, birds obviously travel, well, some birds anyway, travel a lot further than bees on average. Okay, so some of our birds, like rainbow lorikeets, can travel great distances in search of food, which obviously will help if they're transporting that pollen. So if we're looking at gene flow and we're trying to maximise the genetics within a population, or perhaps you've got a very fragmented landscape and only a few trees spread across large distances, birds are able to really connect those islands of trees or plants in search of food. Whilst bees, they're a little bit different. Yes, they are capable of travelling large distances, honeybees. They can travel up to 10 kilometres, but on average, they will not want to be doing that. They'll want to stay really focused in on that one plant in particular, okay, because it's obviously going to be expending a lot of energy to be able to fly that kind of distance. It also matters how they carry the pollen. So if we think about a honeybee and we think about those saddlebags that it carries, when it gets the pollen, it's actually collecting it to eat. Okay, so what it will do is it will glean it off itself, off its hairs, and then pack it into those saddlebags, that corbiculae, which are on those hind legs. Once the pollen is in those hind legs, it's actually really unable to be used for pollination. Okay, mainly because those saddlebags won't really come into contact with the stigma itself. But if we think about this blue-faced honeyeater here and how it's moving and how it's eating, it's very likely that when it moves from flower to flower, it will come into contact with the stigma, and the pollen could adhere to that stigma because it's using the same part of its body to feed continuously. So it also really matters how they clean themselves. So obviously honeybees like to clean themselves quite fastidiously. Okay, so they'll be grooming and cleaning themselves very frequently each time they visit a flower, whilst birds typically won't do that. They'll be moving from flower to flower, usually between trees, and therefore higher chance of them collecting pollen and then spreading it, and more chance of them actually causing out-cross pollination within those plants as well. Yeah, we've kind of covered that. What parts do they touch? It's super important as well. All right. So pollinators in Australia. Well, a lot of our plants in particular you would know that they're very showy. They're very large, like this Banksia here. They're very nectar rich, and they're obviously not only just very large in size, but the way that they flower is often very indicative of them being visited by vertebrate pollinators. Okay, so a lot of our plants themselves have actually co-evolved with the vertebrate bird pollinators that we have here in Australia. And you can think about this in terms of all the Banksias and the Callistemons and the Grevilleas and the Eucalypts that we have. And likewise, with the high diversity of vertebrate pollinated plant species that we obviously have quite an array of honey eater species as well, with 78 in Australia, but also many other species of parrots and lorikeets and other birds obviously eat and move between flowers and therefore are pollinators as well. Okay, so huge diversity of nectar-rich plants that have co-evolved with our bird pollinators. So on the flip side, honeybees in Australia, they're obviously native to Europe, and they were introduced here about 200 years ago for the honey that they produce, but also for agriculture, because obviously they play a crucial role in the pollination of many of our crops. Okay, those managed hives, they're used for agriculture and honey production, and they're on a large scale, obviously. But the problem really occurs when we have them swarm. So when managed hives break away, they create a swarm. Those swarms then can invade our native ecosystems. And that's when we really come into trouble. So that's when we create feral honeybees, and no one's managing them at all. Okay, several reasons that can be a problem. Obviously, they're invading native ecosystems. They're taking resources from those ecosystems. But also they're harbours of disease because no one's actually effectively managing them as well. And unfortunately, Australia has among the highest feral colony density in the world. And some estimates have found that it's up to 150 hives per square kilometre. And that's just absolutely huge for our systems. And you can imagine that's a largely down to the climate. That we have quite mild climate here in Australia, so the honeybees can be active for longer periods of time versus in Europe. And also it's our trees. So we have a lot of hollow-bearing trees, and that's fantastic for the honeybee who needs a hollow to make its nest, its hive in. And really, this is a massive problem when we think about each hive can actually contain 20,000 to 80,000 individual workers. There's a huge number of these animals that are actually in our ecosystems and therefore able to extract not just the pollen, but also the nectar that's within those systems. And a lot of the research that our team has been doing has really focused in on looking at where honeybees are existing and what they're doing within those systems. And we've found that honeybees in Australia can inhabit deserts. So last year, I trekked the Larapinta Trail and consistently saw honeybees along the Larapinta Trail, which was pretty concerning. And we found them in rainforest ecosystems, in salt marsh, endangered salt marsh communities, heathland, and forests. So really, they're a very, very widespread problem here in Australia. So why do we care, and what is the actual problem with honeybees? So obviously, because our plant species have co-evolved with vertebrates, that means that they're also accessible for these tiny insects. Okay, so those large showy flowers are easily able to be visited by honeybees, which means that in many of our systems now, the honeybee is actually the most numerous pollinator. Doesn't mean it's the most effective, but it is the most numerous, which is problematic when we're thinking about genes and how the honeybee will move between the different flowers and what kind of pollination they might be enacting on those plant species. And this really affects the type of pollen that's transferred. Okay, so there is different qualities of pollen, different genetic diversity of pollen. in terms of, if it's self-pollen within a plant or if it's between individual plants. And this is when honeybees obviously can differ greatly from how birds would pollinate a plant. So we'll just go through one of the types of pollen transfer that we look at specifically, which is inter versus intra plant movements. So typically, what you might have if you've got honeybees pollinating a plant is they like to just move within a plant. Makes sense, because they're not going to use as much energy, okay? So they'll find a great resource and they'll just work over each flower on the tree or on the shrub, okay? Once they've exhausted those, they might move a small distance. If there's one close by, they'll move close by. So that might be about 5 meters or something like that, okay? Very short distances. And what we find then is that we get a lot of intra-plant movement, so within a plant movement. Obviously, if this plant species is self-compatible or partially self-compatible, that means we've got self-pollen being moved around this plant, okay? Versus birds. And most birds are quite skittish and obviously try to, they might visit a couple of flowers within a tree, but they also fly between trees very frequently and between individual flowers as well. So interplant movements are far more frequent when it comes to our bird species. And some studies have found that they, can move tens of kilometres away to then find another floral resource. So you can see there's quite a disparity between the distances that pollen is being transported by honeybees versus our bird pollinators. And really, this all comes down to conserving energy. Okay, so what does this mean for the plant? Well, from a plant's perspective, if it's being pollinated by honeybees, there can be changes to that genetic flow, okay, especially if that plant has been adapted for bird pollination. That in turn could affect the number of seeds that are set. So you might find, like in this case on this banksia that we've got in this photo, seed set might be actually through the roof, okay? So it might be a lot more seed set than it's normally used to. So perhaps seed size might be different. It might be lower, okay? Because there's always a cost or benefit trade-off there. So, we might get an increase in seed set, but the seed quality might not be as good, okay? That could in turn mean that there's changes to the seed bank. So what's available within the soil at any given time if we've got honeybees as a dominant pollinator within that system. In turn, that can affect plant abundance within our ecosystems, and even persistence could change over time. Okay, so we've got flow-on effects if we've got an introduced pollinator that differs in the way that it's moving and the way that it's transporting those genes. Okay, so the problem with honeybees impacts on birds and other nectavores. Here's a photo of a semi-trailer with a whole bunch of beehives on the back of it. And this is pretty typical in the areas that we've been working in. So a lot of the big honey companies, they have access to forests. And you can often see the big trucks come in, usually overnight, because the bees are in their hives. And then the next day, they'll open up the hives and then release them into the ecosystem so that they can go forage on all the nectar. That nectar will then make the honey that we like to eat. Okay, so you can see here that there's a huge risk in terms of how many individual bees are being saturated into these environments, and just overnight. Okay, so it's not like the birds can adapt and find other resources away from these honeybees instantly. It's a very quick and sudden influx of honeybees that can swamp these areas. And honeybees can be aggressive. So there is potential there for them to be aggressive towards our native birds within these systems, because obviously they're trying to get food resources as well. And often pollen is that major protein source and it's limited. Okay, so if we're swamping the area with honeybees and they're obviously taking a lot of the nectar out for the honey. They're obviously taking a lot of pollen for their brood and to eat as well. Okay, so a lot of that pollen is then taken out of the environment. So it's not available for birds that are nectivorous, or pollinivorous, but also it's not available for sexual reproduction for the plants either. And the quantity of nectar that's removed from these systems is huge in terms of honey production. So here in Australia, yes, we do have a lot of nectar, but when we're taking a lot of those resources out of the environment, really need to think about what are those potential impacts on birds in particular and the resources that they're relying on, especially when we're thinking about other disturbance factors like fire, like drought, like climate change. That's affecting how the flowering cycles are going through. So, eucalypts and how they're flowering, but also just the amount of resources that are available within those environments. So it's really paramount that we kind of look at how honeybees are really impacting those nectivorous birds in terms of their food sources. The other part is obviously bird nesting resources. And I'm sure many of you have stories of this, where you're trying to pop up more resources for birds in terms of artificial hollows, or you might have natural hollows on your property or within a restoration site, and honeybees are able to occupy them, especially feral honeybees, those ones that have swarmed and broken off. So it's of a real concern in terms of bird nesting sites as well. And this is especially problematic in terms of landscapes with limited hollows. So things like in agricultural areas where the landscape's already highly fragmented, and perhaps there's no longer large, century trees that are producing hollows. You might have more nest boxes there, or just limited nesting hollows that are natural, and it's quite possible that honeybees will take up residency within those areas. And there's been quite a few studies looking at the uptake of feral honeybees in artificial hives and in nesting hollows here in Australia. This one study looked at 303. It found about 4%, so it equated to about 303 of the hives that they were, the hollows that they had were occupied by honeybees in South Australia. And then in this study, there was about 12% over an 11-year period on Kangaroo Island that were occupied by honeybees as well. So it does change depending on the ecosystem. But also honeybees can take over nest sites with birds that have actually occupied the site as well. There's been quite a few reports of nesting wood ducks where bees have actually taken over the hive or tried to, turn birds away from nesting in that hollow because they've then occupied it. And there's many factors that will drive the rate of honeybee occupancy within artificial hives, artificial hollows, sorry. And this will include things like nest box material. So the material you use can actually influence whether or not you get honeybees taking up residency. Also, the availability of hollows just naturally within the landscape. That will dictate whether or not they'll take up residency, but also the abundance of feral honeybees within the area as well. So where are honeybees currently allowed? Well, in New South Wales, they are identified as a key threatening process, which is fantastic, but no other state has actually labelled them as such. And what's quite worrying is very recently, APRIS have now gained access to Queensland national parks. So they have issued licenses for APRIS to now be able to put their hives into national park areas. There is a big push here in New South Wales as well for access to national park lands, especially after the 2019-2020 bushfires. There was a big push by the apiary industry to then gain access so that they can produce more honey. And in New South Wales, some apiarists already have lease agreements. So when the Broa mite first came to Australia. That's a mite that affects honeybees. Our team was trying to work out areas where we could potentially set up sites away from managed hives here in New South Wales. And it became very clear very quickly that getting over 10 kilometres within a national park away from managed hives, especially when there's these lease agreements in place, it's actually very hard. So really what that means is that there's very limited areas that are available to just native pollinators that aren't accessed by managed bees. But what's even more worrying is it's not just managed bees, it's actually feral bees that are in those locations as well. So yes, it's very hard for us to get away from managed bees, but it's even more difficult if you ever wanted to try and get away from feral honeybees here in Australia. It's almost impossible. So what this means is that there's really hundreds of managed hives that are brought into our protected native ecosystems and that are currently harvesting those resources that otherwise potentially could have gone to birds and other nectivorous animals. And there's no active removal of hives from national parks. I'm always very hopeful that there will be active removal, although it's a very difficult task. But I think that's something that we really need to try and raise awareness of in terms of, us understanding the impact that honeybees can have, and therefore what means we need to try and control feral honeybees as well. So I mentioned the varroa mite, and there's been some articles written in the conversation by Patrick O'Connor, which you can see here in the corner. But really, so the varroa destructor mite, you can see here in this picture, tiny mite that attaches itself to the bee itself and eats the fat on the bee. You probably have heard on the news that in 19th of September 2023, the National Management Group made a decision to move from eradication of that mite to just managing the mite. Okay, so originally it was trying to, suppress the mite, get rid of it, and a whole bunch of managed hives were destroyed in that process. But subsequently, they decided that that was kind of futile and that it had kind of ran rampant for too long and there was no way we could control it. So mites have subsequently spread to both managed and feral colonies of honeybees, and the honeybee industry and crop pollination is obviously very much affected by the fact that the managed hives now have varroa mite, which is terrible in terms of our food production. But elsewhere around the world, and this is kind of maybe perhaps a bit of a silver lining, is that when we get varroa mite entering other populations, there's usually a huge decline in the number of feral honeybees within the area as a result of that varroa mite. And usually it's because the varroa mite itself obviously can impact the hive and make it more weak, but it's also about the diseases that the mite actually carries. And so if anyone's interested in that kind of concept of how the varroa mite actually might cause the collapse of our feral honeybees here in Australia, please go and check out Patrick O'Connor's article in the conversation, because it makes for a very interesting read. And just the other day, actually, there was an article that they found about 9,000 varroa mites on one feral honeybee colony up at the Central Coast in New South Wales. So you can see the numbers of the varroa mite can reach astronomical proportions and can severely affect populations of feral honeybees as well. Okay, so if we get a decline of feral honeybees in Australia, what could this mean for our systems? Well, obviously the effects will be felt on our birds, on our pollination systems, and on our agricultural production. So yes, if there is a decline in feral honeybees, we could see less floral resources removed from our native ecosystems, which would be fantastic for our native birds and for our invertebrates that rely on those resources. This is likely to support more native species in the long run, so we might see abundance of those species increase potentially. We might see pollination systems restored, for these bird-pollinated plants anyway, a bit more to how they would have been pre-honeybee. state. We also could have decreased risk of disease transfer from those feral hives to managed hives, which would be fantastic for our agriculture and our apiarists as well, because they won't be a disease reservoir. And also what it will mean for our cropping systems will mean that obviously a lot of our crops are dependent on feral honeybees, but also managed hives. So there's really an opportunity here for our agriculture as well, in terms of managed hive industry, because they'll be in greater need into the future. Okay, so there is a great potential there for them as well. So what can we do? How do we support Australian native pollination systems? Well, first of all, I'm sure everyone knows here that you can plant endemic native plants. So they're the ones that are actually native to your area, because your birds that have adapted in your area and that live in your area will thoroughly enjoy the endemic plants that you offer within your area as well. And that also helps the pollination within those systems as well. If you're installing nest boxes, make sure you check them regularly and get rid of any honeybee colonies that have entered them. Don't buy honeybees to support bee conservation. This is one of those things that I think has kind of taken off in recent years in terms of people wanting their own hives, especially to save the bees. But hopefully I've convinced you all now that saving the bees is not done through keeping a honeybee hive in your backyard. There are other ways that we can support our native bees. And if you do have any honeybee hives, just make sure that you prevent them from swarming. So I wrote an article with some colleagues kind of recently in the conversation. If any of this tickled your fancy or you wanted to read more about feral honeybees in Australian environments, please go and check out our article. And that's kind of it from me. If you want to follow any of our research, you can use the QR code here. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was really interesting. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come through while you've been speaking, so let's talk about it. And while we do that, if anyone has any other questions, you're more than welcome to pop them in the chat. So quite a few people were wondering about bees and population trends, and I know that part of your research deals with impacts of things like fire. So do insect pollinators rebound after fires like what we had in the east a couple of years ago?
Yep. Yeah, so one of my main research areas after those fires was actually in agricultural areas around Gilpin, which is in New South Wales. It's a big apple growing region. But what's unique about Gilpin is that it's surrounded by two national parks, the Wallamai National Park and the Blue Mountains National Park. And so what we were looking at is the populations of feral honeybees as well as native bees within national parks and within the agricultural lands. What we found was that there was a decrease, especially quite dramatically after the fire event, because they were so severe, those fires. So obviously it would depend on the severity of the fire itself, but also it depends on how big of an area, the extent of the fire. So what we found was that the agricultural areas in that regard, they didn't necessarily all burn. Some properties did, but most didn't. So they were actually like kind of islands or refugia, if you like, that were able to offer the bees resources after that fire event. So yeah, there's definitely fluctuations, ebbs and flows in populations of bees. And I think we'll absolutely see that with the varroa mite as well. So we might, initially see quite a dramatic decline with the varroa mite, but there's certainly populations that have adapted very comfortably to live with varroa mite as well. So there's potential there for them to overcome the mite as well.
From those disturbance events like the fires around Gilpin, do we have any idea of the timeframes that recovery takes?
Yeah, so our research showed that really there wasn't any floral resources available in the bushland for 9 months post-fire. And that was in a high severity canopy burnt fire landscape in dry sclerophyll woodland. So I think it'll depend obviously on the ecosystem that you have, what fire adapted plants you have, how quickly they can reach the floral mature stage. But really in that system, we were looking at 9 months between us being able to then pick them back up and see where they are. Yeah, doesn't mean they couldn't survive. They were probably just traveling a lot further for their resources. Yeah.
We have a similar question from Kerry, who's down in Tasmania, and she feels that last year she was seeing a lot fewer native bees. So what other kind of factors might be affecting that?
Yeah, so Kerry, great question. The last 3 years have been appalling in terms of our poor bees, our poor native bees, mainly because of how wet it's been. So our native bees really only come out when it's 17, 18 degrees. They're a bit like me. I like the warmth. But honeybees can forage at 10 degrees. And I've seen them on days where it's almost sleeting come out and forage. So our native bees really don't like it being that cold. They certainly don't like it being wet, and they don't like the wind. So the last 3 years has been pretty dismal for our native populations. Yeah.
That's pretty scary, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions about why the varroa mite doesn't seem to affect native bees and insects as much. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the varroa mite's actually evolved, originally with the Asian honeybee and has transferred onto Apis mellifera as well. So they're Apis bees. In Australia, we don't have any native Apis bees. So they haven't adapted to adhere to our native bees. So they don't affect them in that regard. But what they can do potentially is transfer disease. So like I said before, when a lot of the colony collapse disorders that we're talking about, and when varroa, affects populations, is actually not necessarily just the mite itself, but it's actually the disease transfer that the mite does. So when the mite's actually going into the hive, it'll go in there, it'll feast, and then it will move adhere to one of the bees and move from hive to hive, because bees don't necessarily always go back to the same hive. They like to suss out what their neighbours are doing. And therein lies the problem. So the varroa can act as a vector for diseases. And that's where the potential occurs. If we've got more disease within our Apis populations, within our feral honeybees and our managed populations, then there's potential there for it to transfer into our native populations. Yep.
I had never quite clicked as to why it wasn't an issue that way. Now I understand that it's more about disease pathways.
Exactly.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about introduced pollinators. So do we know if there's specific plants that introduced honeybees are having a more kind of negative impact on?
Yeah. It's very tricky for us to understand the systems. And one of the largest problems that we come up against is actually trying to exclude honeybees. So one of the biggest problems that our lab faces is actually trying to, if we've got Banksias, for instance, and we're trying to look at a system when we've got just bird pollinated Banksias and when we've got honeybee pollinated Banksias, it's almost impossible for us to remove honeybees from those areas. So we actually can't get a system where we've just got the birds. So what we do is we can remove the birds, and then we can look at the flip side of it, if you like. So we can have an open pollination system where we've got honeybees and we've got birds, and then we can exclude birds and see what the difference is. But yeah, you can see the problem is trying to find systems, A, where the honeybee isn't, so that we can test that. But also there's just not many people that are looking at this at the moment. So yeah, a lot of our pollination research is, I hate to say it, probably 30 to 50 years behind Europe and America. And largely that's down to funding, not because our systems aren't interesting, because they absolutely are. And they're, we've got high rates of endemism and it's just fantastic here in Australia, but really more research needs to be done in that field. So yeah, no, we don't have good baselines yet.
Oh, soon. Maybe if anyone wants to be a student, they can help Amy build
Absolutely.
this research.
That would be fantastic.
What about impacts on bats? Do we know anything about how that interplay might be happening?
between bees and bats?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess bats are an interesting one. The reason being is that because they're nighttime foragers, a lot of the plants that they're kind of on and foraging on, usually their nectar floral resources might come in overnight. So when we're talking about birds and bees, the nectar replenishes usually in the morning for those species, and therefore they're competing with each other. I'm not saying that's not happening with bats, but in a lot of the bat pollinated plants, they actually will replenish overnight as well. So yes, absolutely, there could be competition there. I don't know whether anyone's actually formally tested that. But yeah, it would all certainly come down to when those floral resources are available and what's the overlap, like how many, species that bats visit are actually then also visited by bees. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Do we know if there's any birds that are displaying any adaptive behaviours like shifting foraging times or anything like that?
No, not at the minute. I have
So maybe.
Exactly. I have quite a few master students at the moment trying to look at whether or not the number of honeybees on a particular flower will elicit a type of, different behavioural trait within the bird. So will the bird want to move to a different flower because there's just too many bees on there? Will they avoid flowers that are down low because that's where the bees are foraging, and they'll really focus on like a stratification of resources? So will they just focus on the flowers that are up nice and tall because the bees don't want to go up there? But yeah, we just don't know.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I'm so many questions are coming through. I'm trying to keep up with them and still actually hear what you're saying. What about do feral honeybees have the ability to damage native flowers with their jaws when extracting nectar, or are there any other kind of things like that? They do? Oh,
I do. Yes, I should have said that in my talk. Yes, they can absolutely do it. So honeybees can actually, they're very clever. They can steal resources. And when we say steal resources, what they can do is actively avoid touching the reproductive parts of the flower. So if we've got a flower like this, the reproductive parts might be down here. The bee can actually land up here, cut a hole in the petals, and extract the nectar through there instead of actually pollinating the plant itself. So yeah, they actively avoid the stigma and the pollen and everything else, and they can actually just cut a hole in the flower and then extract the nutrients that way.
And what does that mean for a plant if that's happening?
Yeah, it basically means that they're getting robbed. So they're getting robbed of their nectar, their floral reward that would attract a potential real pollinator, and then they're not getting paid for in terms of the pollination service that they would normally have been provided with. Yep.
I'm trying really hard not to anthropomorphize this, but it's very hard not to. It's just an outrage. So I'm going to change tack a bit. Do we have a gauge on how often managed hives can swarm? Do we know?
It really depends. It depends on a couple of things. It depends on the maintenance of the hive. So how much area is still available within the hive. If the hive's overcrowded, then they'll want to swarm. But it's not just about whether they're overcrowded. It'll be dependent on the weather. So is it, heading into spring, and is there likely to be more floral resources available? How much is in terms of floral resources available within the environment? So they'll often swarm in those warmer months. Weather's good. They're not going to die because once they're outside the hive, they're actually very vulnerable to temperature. When they're inside the hive, they can regulate it very well. But when they're swarming, they're obviously exposed. And that's why in people's backyards or on their bicycles or on their cars, you can see those big swarms. And obviously, if the temperature drops too quickly, they'll die. So they'll pick a time of the year when it's like really nice and warm, and they've got lots of floral resources available. So yeah, kind of comes down to that. But certainly,
so it's complicated. Unfortunately, it's very complicated, which would make it very difficult to fully prevent. You did mention though that there's some kind of substrates in nest boxes that might make honeybees more likely to kind of move in. So what kind of things should people be avoiding?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was that paper that I mentioned there, the goal, which one it was. They went through exactly what types of materials they found were more likely to be invaded by honeybees. So yeah, I'm happy to provide you with that citation if you like, and then you can circulate it.
And what I can do for anyone who's interested is we're going to put a recording of this up on YouTube, and I'll put that paper link to it in the comments there or the description there. So anyone who jumps on there can see that. Because I'm sure everyone who has the nest box in their own garden or community might want to make sure that they're preventing this as much as possible. I know even in our powerful owl work across the East Coast, we often see powerful owl hollows that have been not often, but
it's still happening.
That it's happening, which is not good, given that we're all probably aware of how in short supply hollows are.
Especially for big birds. Exactly right.
So are there native alternatives to honeybees for people who want to have hives in their backyard?
Yeah, certainly are. What I would say is that you can get stingless beehives depending on where you are. So if you're in a warmer climate, especially along the East Coast, stingless bees are okay. But really what you probably want to be doing is not introducing new species into your area. You want to be trying to foster whatever types of pollinators you actually have that are just native and endemic to your area. So, some areas will only have solitary bees, which is totally fine. You might see them as blue-banded bees or cuckoo bees or Lasioglossum or homolictus bees. And really it's just about planting plants that support those bees. And honestly, if you plant it, they will come. I've done that in my garden here, which was an old English cottage garden. It's now a native rainforest. And now the bee diversity here, I keep a list on my fridge, is actually through the roof. Which is so exciting. So I'd really encourage people to plant endemic local species and just see what comes to your garden. And it's kind of nicer when you get something that didn't have to choose your garden, but it did, which is nice.
Oh, that's so cool. Even in for anyone who might be disheartened that they couldn't do a whole native rainforest, I know the Melbourne pollinator corridors can have tiny little verge gardens and still see a return of things like blue-banded bees. So you don't need to have a beautiful, amazing large scale either. You can just have a few potted natives too.
Yeah, absolutely.
That must be really rewarding for you.
Yeah, and I keep a bird list too, everyone, so don't worry. I have a bird list and a bee list.
Both on the fridge sharing prime position.
Exactly right.
A few other questions. Earlier in the evening, you mentioned that birds will move a lot further when they're seeking nectar resources and things like that. But why would they do that? Why does that make sense?
Look, it really comes down to the skittish nature of many bird species. Some things like rainbow lorikeets, yes, they'll feast on flowers in like this eucalypt that you've seen in this picture, very happily. But then in times when things are a bit more scarce, they might move a bit further distances. If you think about it in terms of I often look at the red wattlebirds in my garden here, and they're a bit flighty. They just want to move between trees. And I don't know if that's more of a predator kind of response or just maybe they have more energy. But I guess that's just the nature of how they're moving and foraging at the same time. Or even if you think about eastern spinebills, you don't really see them just being sedentary in one spot. They're really quick moving, fast paced and moving between shrubs and yeah.
Do you have any resources that you'd recommend for people who do want to get some endemic plants to their area?
Oh, yes. The wing bee people. So the wing bee powerful pollinators guide, there's loads of them. So if you just Google wing bee powerful pollinators, they've created a whole bunch of resources for pollinators that are specifically for local areas. So if your local area isn't on one of those lists, then I would say your local council is a good bet, or your local land care service. They both would have access to great species lists that are endemic to your area, which means that you won't just have to go to Bunnings and buy a generic Banksia. You will get a Banksia that's native to your area. So I would strongly recommend either the Ween Bee Powerful Pollinators Guides, which I've helped write several of them, or your local land care service. Yeah.
I love those Ween Bee guides. For anyone who hasn't seen them, they have that really useful interface of time of year that things are flowering to, which is really hard to find anywhere else. And if you don't know every single species, it's really hard to try and get that spread in your garden otherwise. So thank you, Amy. I appreciate it.
Yeah. No, they are good guides.
So bees are really important to agriculture. We know this, but in what way or to what extent do birds and other pollinators support our agriculture?
Yeah, so birds do it in a number of ways, mainly through getting rid of pests. So they'll, get rid of the pest species and the pest insects that are within our agriculture, and they play a crucial role in doing that. In terms of pollination of our agricultural crops, I can't think of many examples where I've seen birds necessarily, because a lot of our crops are actually very small flowered. They're not those big showy flowers. I can't really think about where our birds are pollinating crops. And that's kind of like, on the flip side of that though, there's lots of native bees that are pollinating our crops. And quite often in some systems, they're actually the most numerous. So a lot of mangoes are pollinated by a stingless bee, Tetragonia mellipes, up north. In Gilpin itself, a lot of our apples are actually pollinated in that region by Tetragonia carbonaria. And even out west in Orange and Young, I found loads of different native bees that are pollinating our cherries and other crops, macadamias and things. So yeah, there's lots of natives that are playing a crucial role, but in terms of, our agricultural areas, they're often very simplistic in terms of the diversity of flowers that are on offer. And so really it's not conducive for our native pollinators in those areas, because we've cleared the native bushland, so there's not much habitat for them. There's not much flowering outside of that crop period. So really it's hard for us to foster native pollinators within those areas. It's not impossible, and we're absolutely trying to implement strategies that can encourage native pollinators within agriculture, and we're certainly moving away from that idea of clear felling everything and getting rid of all floral diversity, and that's fantastic, because that will just encourage native pollinators and native birds to be within those systems, and obviously can help through beneficial reduction of pests and things within those systems. Yeah.
We are nearly on time, but I'll just squeeze in maybe 2 more questions because I can't help myself. So how do you know if the bees in your garden are feral or if they're coming from a managed hive that's nearby?
Almost impossible to tell. Yep, exactly right. Very, very, very hard to tell. Yes, we've done some studies to try and look at the proportion of feral and managed. And what we did was we put fluorescent dye at the front entrance of a hive, managed hive in the area, and then looked at, they had to kind of go through the powder, get dusted with the powder, and then we knew every time we saw a green or an orange bee that was our managed and that anything else was our feral. But really it's very hard to tell.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah. Now, have you ever seen any anti-bee aggression from honeyeaters or miners? Do you see that?
That is something that I'm very interested in, and that is what we're trying to look at now. But yes, I'm not sure what the answer is there yet.
So I think we'll have to have you back next year then, so we can have a whole session on all of these behavioural interactions that we're just going to uncover now, yeah?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm very interested to know, especially in systems where we are getting huge numbers of honeybees swamping flowers. I'm very interested to know, are the birds just displaced and they don't want to go to them? Are they showing aggression? Are they trying to forage on flowers that don't have many? I'm just not sure Yeah.
Oh, and you know what I think we always find is we assume things are a lot simpler until we start studying them, and then we realize that there's so many kind of complex interplays happening. So I'm sure that there's all sorts of different responses happening.
Yep.
We just haven't looked.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
we're going to close it there, and I will pop this recording on YouTube in the coming week for anyone who's interested. The YouTube page is BBTV. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Amy. I know I got so much out of that, so I hope everyone else did too. Is there any kind of advice you'd want to say in closing for anyone who does want to support native pollinators in their own home?
Well, I think number one, obviously, participate in the birds and backyard surveys. I
Oh,
think
of course.
so they're really a great source of information for everyone, but also some of my students. So that's excellent. I think there's also Australian Native Pollinator Week. So you can get involved in that, and there's a survey involved in that. So for those of you who like surveying, and yeah, I think the main take home is really thinking about how you can implement strategies at home to support pollinators in whatever way you can. So even if you've got an apartment, which I certainly used to live in an apartment, and I planted natives on my little patio as well, or if you've got a property where you can revegetate, all of it can help. And yeah, I think we should all try and do our little bit. And it's nice watching the birds and the bees on flowers.
Oh, that's awesome. I feel so inspired. I hope everyone else does. So thank you so much. And I'll end the meeting now, but everyone enjoy the rest of your night. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.